This tutorial is another of my series of videos showing how I did it, how I edited a single photograph from start to finish. The photograph that I'm going to work with today is a portrait of my high school art teacher, Don Goss. I graduated from Elmhurst High School in Fort Wayne, Indiana in 1994. Mr. Goss had been the school's longtime art teacher. He went to Elmhurst High School himself and graduated in 1949. After he graduated from college, he returned to Elmhurst as an art teacher, and he taught there for 56 years until the school closed in 2010. A good many of Mr. Goss's former students, myself included, have become professional artists and professional photographers. I made this photograph of him a few days ago, a few days before I made this video, at Elmhurst when the school was opened up for a final tour for Elmhurst alumni and teachers before the school was torn down. The school was closed in 2010, and the building was recently sold, and the new owners plan to demolish it. This photograph was kind of a hard one to work with because I photographed Mr. Goss in the school's gym. They had tables and chairs set up for people to socialize on the floor of the basketball court in the gym. The lighting was very harsh lighting from overhead. It was pretty much from straight up from the ceiling, which is pretty much a worst case scenario for portrait lighting. And it was some kind of an artificial light that was very red in tone, probably some kind of halogen bulbs. So as you can see here, the color is terrible. It's very, very red looking. And I use my camera's auto white balance setting for this. A lot of times I'll use a handheld color temperature meter to measure the proper white balance settings to use on my camera. But I didn't take it with me when I was doing these last photographs of Elmhurst because we were walking through the school in groups, and I wouldn't have time to work with that. I had to work quickly, so I just used the camera's auto white balance setting with the expectation that the results probably wouldn't be perfect, but I can adjust the white balance when I process the raw files in Lightroom later, which is what I'm doing here. And so even with the auto white balance, it didn't do a good job. And if you've seen my video on white balancing, auto white balance settings in cameras do a terrible job with tungsten light, incandescent light, and halogen lights. Considering how long those kinds of light sources have been used, it's been more than 100 years since they were invented. It's amazing to me that digital camera manufacturers can't have an auto white balance function in their cameras that can correct for it. But they don't. I've never seen a digital camera that does a good job with these light sources, so you see here that the results are very, very red. Now, in Lightroom, there are several ways you can do white balancing. One way is to look at the presets here and choose one of them. I almost never do this because I find that very rarely do they give the correct results, even if you choose the kind of light source that the preset is for. These, I believe, were shot under tungsten or halogen lights. I'm not exactly sure what the light source was because the actual bulbs were concealed behind diffuser screens on the ceiling. But let's choose the tungsten setting just to see what we get. Well, that doesn't look very good. That's way too blue. Makes the skin tones look really dead and terrible. So let's go back to the as shot again. Now we have an auto setting where Lightroom can automatically determine white balance, and sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. Most of the time I find that I don't really like the results it gives, but we'll try it here to see. Once again, this looks a lot like the results we got from the tungsten setting. They're too blue. Now another option is the Eyedropper Tool. And the idea behind the Eyedropper Tool is you find something in the picture which is either white or neutral gray, and you click on it. And Lightroom will then come up with a white balance setting that will make that white or gray subject you clicked on look actually white or neutral. And from that white balance setting, everything else then should fall into place and the picture should look right. Now in actual practice, this often doesn't work because many things that are white or white or gray in the real world are not truly neutral white or neutral gray. If it's a warm white or a cool white or a warm white gray or a cool gray, you're going to get inaccurate white balance settings doing this. Now there's not much in this picture that we can really choose from because everything seems to have, almost everything in the picture is colored, but we do have Mr. Goss's white hair. So let's try that. And that looks a little bit better than the auto setting in Lightroom or the tungsten setting, but it's still too blue. It really isn't what we want. So that leaves us one other option, and that's manually setting it by manipulating the color sliders. Now the color sliders, there's two color sliders. One is for color temperature, and this manipulates the change between blue and red. So if the picture's too red like it is now, you pull it to the left to make it cooler. If it were too blue, then we would pull it to the right to make it warmer. The tint setting goes between green and magenta, and we usually don't have to mess with this much when you're shooting under either daylight or incandescent or tungsten or halogen. Those kind of light sources don't tend to require much change in this. This is mostly used for LED lights and for fluorescent lights, because fluorescent lights and some LEDs have a very strong green cast to them, and so using the tint slider can give you the ability to remove that green cast. So we're going to start with the temperature slider, and because this picture is too red, we're going to slide it to the left toward the blue, and we can see the picture is becoming cooler. And that actually doesn't look too bad. His hair looks fairly neutral. The skin tone is not too bad. I think it's magnified up here and look at it closer. When we look at it closer, it looks like a pretty good, accurate skin tone. His lips really do look that purple. Mr. Goss is in poor health, and I think that's one of the manifestations of it. I hadn't seen him in a few years when I took this picture, and he's having a lot of trouble talking now. Has a real soft, hoarse voice now. When I look at it from further away, his skin seems to look a little bit too cool, but when I look at it up close, it looks good. I think... Now let's try it a little bit warmer and see what we get. This looks, I don't know, it looks a little bit too red to me, because his skin tone in real life was a little bit cooler in tone than that. I think something like this really is more accurate to what he really looked like. Mr. Goss is 86 years old now, and as I said, he's in pretty poor health, so I think that's affected how his skin looks. I'm trying to get it to look like him. If I were photographing someone who was... if I was photographing someone else, I may have wanted the skin tone to be a little bit warmer, someone who was healthier, but his skin really looks like this, so I think I'm going to leave it that way. Now, the next thing we need to look at is some of the highlight areas are too light. Like, see how bright his nose is here? Some of these areas here are a little bit too light. And that's a function of the light coming from straight down above, from directly on the ceiling. Things that are sticking out like the top of his nose are going to be overexposed compared to things that are parallel to the light source, like the front of his face. Now, one thing that was great about that was it didn't produce any glare on his glasses. You get that if the light's pointing at the glasses directly from in front or from an angle, but when it's coming from straight down, it really doesn't have any opportunity to reflect off the glasses, and so we were able to get, I could see his eyes real well here without any kind of glare to remove, which is really nice. But we need to deal with these highlight areas here. So if we go down here in Lightroom, we could pull the exposure down to bring the exposure back, or bring the tones back, but then everything else is going too dark. So let's put this back up to normal. Another option is to pull down the highlight slider, and that's helping. That's bringing in the detail in these areas. If we moving the shadow slider isn't really affecting things much. It's giving us a little bit of extra light into some of these deep shadows, which I think I'd like to have so that it doesn't look like such a high contrast harsh light. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that. Let's see how far we want to go. I think we'll leave it with that. Now the next thing we need to do, now that we've got the tonality and the color the way we want, is we need to go down and deal with sharpening and noise reduction. This was shot at ISO 6400 on a Canon 5D Mark II, so it is noisy. The gym is pretty dimly lit, and this was an issue even when I was a student there 25 years ago. I was the school newspaper photographer, or one of the school newspaper photographers, and trying to photograph our basketball team playing in this dimly lit gym was a nightmare. We would shoot with Kodak T-Max 3200 black and white film back then. This was, of course, long before any digital stuff was available. And even with 3200 speed film, it was a challenge to be able to shoot with a shutter speed high enough to stop the action of the basketball players, running around, jumping, and shooting. It was a little easier here with Mr. Goss because he wasn't moving around. He was sitting there in his chair, and I was sitting on another chair in front of him. So basically, I needed to get a shutter speed that was hand-holdable and a small enough aperture that I could have, his whole face sharply focused. And we ended up shooting, and you can see here, Lightroom tells you what settings you use for a picture. 1/45 of a second at f8. And the 75mm is the zoom setting I used on the lens. I used the Canon 24 to 105mm f4 L lens that has image stabilization. It's the lens that came on my camera. But even then, I still had to shoot at ISO 6400 to get that kind of a easily hand-holdable shutter speed with the aperture I needed. And so you can see it's noisy, but it's sharp. You can see his eyelashes there. You can see the individual strands of hair. It looks good, but we want to get rid of some of that noise. And when you increase the noise reduction to get rid of the noise, you lose some sharpness. So we also have to increase the sharpening to compensate for that to some degree. Usually when I'm shooting at ISO 6400 with this camera, I use a sharpening setting of 40 and a radius setting of 0.7 and a detail setting of 30. Now these are numbers that I've arrived at from several years of using this camera and trying different settings and getting used to how the sensor works at different ISO settings. Now these sharpening settings would not work well at a different ISO. If you're shooting at ISO 100, you can actually get away with using higher sharpening settings than you can with the high ISO settings. If I were to use as much sharpening with this picture as I would use with an ISO 100 shot, the noise would be really, really horrible. And so you have to use a different setting for different ISO speeds that you're using on the camera. And my experience has been with the 6400 ISO on this camera. And of course, this will depend on what camera you're using too. If you have a 5D Mark II, you can probably use the settings I'm giving you here. If you're using a different model of camera, one from a different manufacturer, even a different Canon model, they may work or they may not. It's something you're going to have to work out. But these are good starting point settings. Now, masking here, what masking does is it reduces the amount of sharpening used in flat tonal areas that don't have detail in them. Things like the sky, for example, would be a place where you'd want to use masking, because if you don't use masking, sometimes the noise will be accentuated in those flat tones that don't have detail, because detail will kind of break up the appearance of noise. And you can see here that the noise is really not so visible in the hair because there's all that detail in there that's kind of obscuring it. But if we look here in the flat areas of Mr. Goss's skin, the noise is much more obtrusive. And especially in some of these background areas where you've got soft out of focus backgrounds, the noise looks really bad. And the masking setting I use for ISO 6400 is usually 45. And that's reduced the noise a bit, but we're also going to use the noise reduction down here in the noise reduction section. With my camera, I almost never have to change the color noise setting. I usually leave it at Lightroom's default of 25. Luminance noise is a bigger issue with this camera than color noise. Luminance noise is like the grainy look here. Color noise would be if you have splotches of color that don't belong in a picture. And you can see mostly what we're getting is kind of a grain effect rather than splotchy color. So I'm going to set the luminance noise reduction. Let's try it at 20. Or let's try, well, not 220. We don't want to do that. Let's try 20 to start with. And we can see that doesn't really totally get rid of the noise in the background, but if we look at Mr. Goss's face, which is the most important thing in the picture, most of the noise is reduced here, and it's smoothed out that noise here under his glasses and on the skin, so I think I'm going to leave it like this. Now I could raise the noise reduction and the masking settings higher to get rid of the background noise, but that will end up making his skin look really plasticky, and I'll go ahead and show you the effect here. Actually, I had it set to 100. Let's set it to 100. It's the highest it's got. And look what it does to the detail. It just totally screws up the appearance of his face. It looks like someone's coated his face with rubber or something. It doesn't even look natural. Now the backgrounds, out of focus backgrounds, look great. They're perfectly smooth, but we don't want that effect on our subject because we want actual detail and we want it to look like a real human being, not a wax sculpture. So let's go ahead and pull this back down to 20. If it'll let me have 20, let's do it manually. There we go. And we see now everything looks a little more natural. You can still see the eyelashes in there. We can still see detail in his skin. Now the next thing we're going to do is the lens corrections. Remove chromatic aberration is something I use with every picture. Most modern lenses have some chromatic aberration, and what chromatic aberration is if you have hard edges between two things in the picture, like kind of the quintessential thing that tends to bring that out is tree branches against the sky. Sometimes you'll get like purple or greenish fringing around those edges, and that's a optical defect of lenses, and all lenses have some of it to some extent. One of the great things about digital is that we can remove that in software, and so that's what this does. Lightroom's built-in correction for this is pretty good, and most of the time I don't have to do anything else other than clicking the little checkbox here. Sometimes with my landscape pictures I'll find that I have to add a little bit more correction by going to the manual tab here and then pulling up either the purple one or the green one, depending on which type of chromatic aberration I'm seeing. And which kind you get depends on what lens you've got, and it can even depend on which focal length you're using. If it's a zoom lens might have a different kind of chromatic aberration at one focal length than it does at another. But we're not going to deal with that here because that wasn't needed for this picture. Now the next thing is enable profile corrections. And what this does is it corrects for two different things that you see with lenses. One is distortion. And distortion is where a lens will render straight lines as not straight. They might be rendered curved inward or curved outward. That's an optical defect of lenses, and it's something that's always been with us, but in the past we always kind of had to live with it back in the days of film. Today with digital, software can take it off. You can see here where it says lens profile. Lightroom comes with profiles for a lot of different lenses manufactured by the camera companies like Canon and Nikon and Fuji and such, and it also has profiles for a lot of third-party lenses. So if you're shooting with a Sigma lens or a Tamron or Tokina or whatever, there's profiles for a lot of those built in Lightroom as well. The profile basically tells the software how much distortion correction and how much vignetting correction to give for that lens at the different focal length settings available if it's a zoom. Now, in addition to distortion, it also corrects for vignetting. And what vignetting is a lot of lenses, the image that they produce is darker in the edges and corners than it is in the center. And so the vignetting correction lightens up those edges so that they're the same brightness as the center, so you have even looking lighting over the picture. There are times with some types of pictures that I don't want the vignetting correction because having the darkened edges and corners can sometimes be useful as an effect that leads the eye inward toward the center if you have a centered subject like Mr. Goss's face here. It's very useful for portraits. It's not something I would normally do for landscapes or architectural work, but for portraits sometimes I want to take the vignetting correction off. And you can do that by taking the slider here, and you can pull it downward, and you can see the edges and corners getting darker. You can turn it all the way to 0 if you want. Now what happens if you go higher than 100? 100 is the full correction. If you go higher, it actually lightens the edges even more than they should be, so the edges would be lighter than the center. I can't see why you'd ever want to do that, but it's an option. The distortion correction I usually leave alone because usually I want the distortion correction. Now on something like a portrait, you probably won't really see much difference because there's nothing that's really a straight line in here that needs to be corrected for. But I'll go ahead and leave it in place. Now one other thing I'm going to do with this picture is after I made the picture, I realized that I felt like there was too much empty space above his head here, so I'm going to crop it. And you do that by selecting the crop tool here, and then the crop box appears, and you can grab the edges and pull them in to crop. I'm just going to pull this down a bit. Once you've chosen the crop you want, hit enter, and then you see it, and it looks good. I think I like that the way it is. Now, what we're seeing here now, if you remember at the beginning I was talking about how some of these things were too light. His nose is too light, for example. I think these are going to need even more darkening, but I don't want to pull the highlight slider down anymore because it's going to flatten the picture real bad. So at this point we're looking at having to do burning in. And burning in is a term used in the darkroom from back in the film days, and we've carried that over into digital. Burning in is basically when you select a certain part of the picture to darken without affecting anything else in the picture. Now the opposite of that would be dodging. Dodging is used if you have dark areas that need to be, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a dark area. Dodging is just used anytime you have something that needs to be lightened. So you would burn if you have an area you want to darken, you would dodge if you have an area you want to lighten. And that's if you want to lighten or darken areas of the picture without affecting the rest of the image. Now there's several different ways you can dodge and burn in Photoshop and Lightroom. I have a video online showing how I do dodging and burning in Photoshop using adjustment layers. That can't be used with Lightroom because Lightroom doesn't have layers. But if you're most of the time, what I would do with a picture like this is I would then export the picture from Lightroom into Photoshop and do the dodging and burning there, because I feel like using adjustment layers in Photoshop is easier to control and is a lot more powerful than the controls for dodging and burning built into Lightroom. And so that's my preferred way to do it. And when I actually processed this picture the first time, I did the dodging and burning in Photoshop. Actually, there was just burning. I didn't do any dodging, but I did the burning in Photoshop, and I burned in the nose. I burned in a little bit of stuff on the chin here, and some of these real bright spots here on his eye. And that's always been the way I've preferred to do it. Now, I know there's some people that would like to stay in Lightroom, maybe don't have Photoshop, or maybe just don't like working with Photoshop. Some people feel Photoshop's too complicated, and it is a big, complicated program. It's got so many tools and so much power, and a lot of the things in there are things that most people would never need. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to show you how to do this in Lightroom. If you're interested in learning how to do it in Photoshop, I have a video online of how to do dodging and burning with adjustment layers in Photoshop, and you can see that on my YouTube channel. Now, Lightroom has a tool for that, and that's what this little tool here on the right is. It's the adjustment brush. And when you click that, all these controls open up. When you select an area with the brush, you can do all the tonal controls you could do to the entire picture, except that here they will only affect what you've drawn on with the brush. You can do the exposure control, you can adjust contrast, you can even change the white balance in one area of the picture without affecting the rest. You can do the highlight and shadow sliders. All this stuff is available to you. Now, one thing you need to look at first is the size of the brush. And when you put the mouse over the size slider, you see the brush appeared over here, and I can see the actual size of it. The circles there show you how big of an area it's going to affect. You see there's two circles. Outside of the circle that has the plus in it, there's two other circles. The circle that's the brighter white, and then there's a dimmer circle, like a kind of a gray line to the outside of that. What those show you, if you see here, we have size and feather. And you see if I adjust the feathering, the outer ring is moving in and out. Basically what this is doing is it's affecting the softness of the edges of the brush. So the main size slider is affecting primarily the brighter white circle on the inside. Now when you increase the size, of course the other circle on the outside, the feathering circle, will increase too, because it's always going to be outside the size circle. What's inside the size circle is the area that will be affected 100% by the brush, and then the feathered area is a softening of that, so that you have a gentle roll off between the areas that you've affected and the areas that were left alone. That way it looks natural. Now, for what I'm going to do here, this size is way too big, because we want to paint on his nose here, and I don't want to do this. I affect half his face doing that. So let's go down here again and reduce the size quite a bit. And you can see this may actually be a little bit too big too. Well, that's way too small. When you get into the smaller sizes, they change very rapidly. I'm going to increase the feather a little bit. Okay, now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to draw on the areas I want to affect. And that's the top of his nose here. Okay, now you can see two things have happened. One is the area I drew on lightened quite a bit. And that's because the exposure says 0.57, so by default it was lightening, and so let's pull this back down to 0 right now so that there's no corrections. We'll do the corrections in a minute. The second thing that appears is this little dot, and the dot is important because you can actually do this to multiple areas at the same time. Each one of them will have a little dot that appears somewhere in the area you've drawn on, and you can actually go back later and select those dots and change the settings that you've put in, and I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. So let's go ahead and affect his nose here. Like I said, we want to darken it. There's two different ways we could do this. We could pull the highlight slider down, which would have the effect of not simply darkening but also reducing contrast within it. Or we could pull the exposure slider down, and that would maintain contrast within the nose without it getting flatter like you would see with the highlight one. Now one thing here, you can see it seems like there's a kind of a bright line here around, like maybe I didn't draw in quite a big enough area, and you can actually do that. You can keep drawing and bring back in areas that look like they weren't affected. You know what, I think I may have actually gone a little too dark, because you can see how this other part of his nose here looks strange now because it's too... Maybe I'll go ahead and darken this too. Yeah, that looks better. Okay, now once you have the corrections done, you've drawn over the area you want, you've put in the corrections you want, hit close, and the corrections stay. Now, if you want to do another area, and we do, I want to darken down this bit of his chin here. Choose the tool again, the adjustment brush tool, and you'll see the dot appears up here. If I wanted to make changes to this, if I touch the dot, you see everything that I painted on turns red, so you can see what area is being affected. I could click on this dot, and you'll see the corrections I put in will appear again, and I can manipulate these if I want to change them. If I decided that maybe I want to go darker or lighter with it or whatever, I can do that. Now, I don't want to do that, though. I like the way it is. I'm going to go ahead and click close again. But I want to do this other area, so let's choose the adjustment brush again. And now we're not going to click this up here. We're going to leave that alone. Now we're just going to paint on the area we want to darken. And as before, the default was 0.57 plus on the exposure, so it's lighter. We can see another dot's appeared. So we can select that dot later and make changes to this just like we could with this one. Now if we go back to 0, this means no corrections, so this is what we started out with. Now let's pull it down and we can see that it's darkening. And I like the effect, I like how that looks. It's not so distracting now. Now there's one other area that I would like to darken, and that's this little spot right here under his nose. Or not under his nose, I'm sorry, under his eye. There's two different ways we could do this. I could do a third area with the adjustment brush, or I could, while I have either this dot or this dot selected, I could add this to the corrections done for one of these other two. And I don't think that this one needs as much correction as I gave to the nose, and I gave less correction to the chin, so I'm going to use this correction for that as well, and it's a simple matter of just painting on the area you want to affect, and you see it darkens down. And I'm going to hit this little spot right here too. And I think that looks pretty good, so once I've got that done, I can hit close. Now you can go back to either of the areas that I've worked on and add other areas to them by choosing the tool, clicking a dot to choose which one I want to add to, and you see the corrections come up, and I can paint on other areas and it'll give to those areas the exact same correction I gave to the nose. Or if I had clicked on this dot, then I could paint on other areas that would get the same correction I gave to the stuff that I've already done. So it's pretty powerful. You can go back to this later and add areas to one of your corrections, or you can change the amount of correction you've given. And once you've got them the way you want, just hit close and they're in there. And you can always go back to these and change them later. Even after you've closed Lightroom, you can come back to it years later even and open a picture and revisit those corrections. So it gives you some of the power you have with adjustment layers if you were using Photoshop. I find the Photoshop adjustment layers to be, to me, a little more powerful and more intuitive. That may be simply because I'm more used to them, because I've been using Photoshop that way for 15 years now, and doing it in Lightroom is somewhat new to me. But whichever software you choose to use, you have the power to lighten and darken specific areas of the picture, or even change their color balance or change their contrast or whatever without affecting everything else by using either the adjustment brush in Lightroom or the adjustment layers in Photoshop. Now I like how this looks now. I think everything looks really great. I got the color looking good. I've darkened in some of these areas that were a little bit too light. I've set the sharpening and the noise reduction to maintain the detail I want while getting rid of some of that obtrusive noise that I got from shooting at ISO 6400. So I think this is done. I think the picture is ready to export. Now there's one other thing that I would probably do to this before I printed it, and that would be this little white spot right here. That's something that's on his jacket. Mr. Goss was wearing this heavy coat with his hood pulled up around his face because the school was not heated. The heat had been turned off in the building years ago. They did have electricity for lights, but there was no heat, and it was cold in there. This was in a November day in northern Indiana, and it gets cold here. And especially if you're going to sit there all day in the cold like that, like Mr. Goss did, you need to be wearing a coat. And, of course, for someone his age is going to be affected more by it than somebody who's, a middle-aged man like me. I'm only 42. But even I wore a heavy coat when I was in there photographing when I was talking to him. And by the time I got home, when I got done, I'd been there a couple hours. I was feeling pretty cold myself, so that's why he's dressed this way. But there's this little white spot, and it's really distracting and ugly, and I would probably do some retouching to get rid of that before I print it. But other than that, the picture is finished, I think. And I like to choose pictures like this that have difficult lighting situations or difficult white balance situations as examples to show you, because a lot of pictures are easy to process, and a lot of people don't have any problems with those. But then when they have a picture that's difficult, where they had unusual lighting like this, or a really horrible white balance that needs to be corrected, then that's what I'm trying to do here, is help you with the most difficult ones. So hopefully this has been useful to you. It's been an interesting picture for me to work on, just because of the challenges of it, and also because the subject was so important to me. Mr. Goss played a big role in helping me start my career as a professional artist and a photographer.